I'm pleased to be here, to be virtually in Kiev. Just a second. I just have a little problem with my computer, but I will solve it. And here we go. I have been studying judgment and errors of judgment for more than 50 years. For the first 45 years or so, I studied errors that most people make, that many people make, and that they share. Those are called biases. For the last 8 or 9 years, I have been studying how people differ from each other in their judgments, how people vary when they should not vary. And that is called noise. And I will speak briefly both about bias and about noise. Now, people that I talk to are always particularly curious about intuition, and they want to know whether they can trust their intuition. And in general, people are strong believers in intuition. Now, intuition is often described as knowing something without knowing how you know it. This is not a very good definition, because knowing, you can only know something if it is true. And defining intuition as knowing something means that any intuition must be true. That's clearly not the case. A better definition, which does not assume that intuition must be true, is believing that you know something without knowing how you know it, or without knowing why you believe that you know it. Intuition, many years ago, I wrote a book, which is probably not very well known in Ukraine, I'm sure. The book was called Fast and Slow Thinking. In English, it was called Thinking Fast and Slow. And I described in that book two ways in which people think. One, which is intuitive, which is immediate, which is in general fast and effortless. I call that fast thinking. And then there is slow thinking, which is more deliberate and more careful and more controlled, although not necessarily correct. Now, intuition belongs to what I call fast thinking. Now, here's how it works, really. Intuitions are that a conclusion comes to your mind. Just an idea, something that you believe in, a belief comes to your mind. It is not anchored in reasoning or in arguments. It just comes to your mind. It's based on automatic mental processes that happen without your intention, without deliberation. They're automatic. Now, perhaps I will surprise you here, but perhaps the best example of intuition is simply recognition. So when a child says, oh, here is a dog, that is an example of intuition. The child has recognized something in the real world. The child has no idea what it is that makes her say that this is a dog. She couldn't describe the reason, she just recognizes the dog. And that's immediate, and a word comes to her mind, and the word is dog, and that's the end of it. Now, this is a very simple intuition, but it's just to give you the idea that intuition and perception and recognition are very closely related. Now, I'll give you an example of an intuition that I think psychologists understand very well. And this is the example. So Julie, a girl, is, say, finishing high school. And I will tell you one fact about Julie. And the fact is that she read fluently when she was 4. And now I'm asking you, what is her average grade in high school? Given, for some reason, I now see you and I don't see my notes. This is not good. Let me. Sorry, it will take me a minute. I don't know what happened. Okay. So now I'm asking you about Julie, that girl who read fluently when she was age 4. I'm asking you, what is her average grade in high school? And the thing is that I'm quite sure that all of you had an intuition, that as a number came to your mind. Now, I have just heard about what the grading system is in Ukraine, but my guess is I was told that the highest number in high school would be 12, and my guess is that the number that came to your mind is somewhere 10 or 11. It's not 12, because some children read even earlier, but it's around 10 or 11. It's very high. Now let's understand exactly what happened. And what happened when a number came to your mind was a pretty complicated process. And it involves mapping from one dimension to another dimension. I could ask you, for example, how tall is a man who is as tall as Julie was precocious in her reading? And again, you'll have some idea of how tall the man is. He is not quite 2 meters tall, but he is tall. He is much taller than average. I could ask you, what is the driving speed of a car that is as fast on the highway as Julie was precocious in her reading? And again, you have an answer to that problem as well. So matching actually is an automatic operation. And matching provides a quick and approximate answer to a difficult question. You really did not think very much. The number came to your mind, and that number was, and now let's see how that number was generated. What you did, instead of guessing her actual grade average, which is difficult, you did something much simpler. You evaluated how precocious she was in her reading. And that, in some sense, you had an impression of where Julie was in her reading in the population of children who learn to read. How many children read even faster and how many children read more slowly, learn to read more slowly than she did. And probably it's 95% of children read after age 4, perhaps more. And this is an impression that you get immediately. When I said Julie read fluently when she was age 4, you get an impression of how precocious she is, and probably of how intelligent she must have been. And this is what you tell me. I asked you, what is the average grade? But you actually told me how precocious she was in reading. You took a difficult question and you answered it in a way that made it easy. Now, I should add about Julie, this is a terrible way of making that judgment. It's not the correct answer. If you think about it, you have just acted in your intuition, in your mind, and I have the same intuition, so all of us are alike here. When we have that intuition, we ignore a lot of things. We seem to assume that whatever we can learn from the fact that Julie read at age 4 is enough to guess her average grade at age 18. And that is really nonsense. A lot of things could have happened between age 4 and age 18 that could have changed her grade. And I'll tell you a little later what is the correct way of making a judgment about Julie, but this is not the way your intuition did it. Now, this leads me to a question that is very often asked about intuition. How accurate are intuitive judgments? Can you trust them? And I gave you an example in the case of Julie, where you really cannot trust them. You should not trust them. But actually, the answer is a little more complicated than that. Intuition is both marvelous and flawed. It is sometimes marvelous and sometimes flawed. When intuitive expertise is where we find the marvels of intuition. So chess players, master chess players, they are experts. And one characteristic of an expert chess player can walk by, see a chess situation, and immediately say, well, white mates in 2 moves. And anything, and that is an intuition. So players have intuition so that the only moves when they are playing, the only moves that come to their mind are strong moves. Then they can think for a long time, calculating which of the strong moves are the better ones. But weak moves simply don't come to their mind. There is intuitive expertise. We have intuitive expertise in many other domains. One is the recognition of danger. And that's been studied with firefighters, people who fight fires, and they develop intuitions about what is going to happen next. There is a famous example of that where the captain of a firefighting company, they were in the kitchen of a house, there was a fire somewhere, and all of a sudden he told his team, let's get out of here immediately, let's not wait. And they ran out and the house exploded just after they left. And later, he could figure out that there actually was a reason for what happened, and that his ears were warmer than usual. And that was an indication that the fire was under the kitchen. And if the fire was under the kitchen, they were in big danger. This is really something that happens. It happens to soldiers, it happens to officers. When you are in an area that is dangerous because there could be an ambush, you have an intuition of danger. And those intuitions tend to be quite reliable. Now, intuition can come, and marvelous intuition, can come completely without words. So basketball players have very fast intuitions. They know who to pass to, they know when to shoot, and they know all these things without thinking about them. This is absolutely immediate. So all of us actually are experts in some things. So when you talk to, say, your mother on the telephone, usually you will know after one word whether she's in a good mood or in a bad mood. That's an intuition. And that is because you are really an expert on your mother's moods. When you drive a car, you sometimes get the feeling that the driver next to you is not a good driver, and you start driving more carefully or trying to avoid that car next to you. That's an intuition, and usually those intuitions are valid. Now, so some intuitions are marvelous, and they can be trusted. But what do all these cases have in common? Well, there are actually three conditions for intuitive expertise. The first one is that the world must have some regularities. There must be some rules in the world, rules that can be detected and can be learned. That's obvious in the case of chess, but it's also the case for firefighters or for basketball players or for recognizing something in your mother's voice. There are regularities and they can be learned. And you become an intuitive expert when you learn those regularities. Then for that, you need a substantial opportunity to detect those regularities in the world. And that can happen either from personal experience or from learning. So chess players learn from playing, but they also learn from books. Firefighters learn from being in fires, but they also learn from being trained, and they also learn from discussing fires with colleagues. So those are opportunities to learn. And the third one, and that's very important, is that when you're actually practicing judgment, you must get rapid feedback on whether your intuitions, your judgment is correct or not. So those are the three conditions, and they're really quite important. Regularity, an opportunity to learn, and rapid feedback when you make a judgment as to whether it is correct or not. When those conditions are not met, you cannot trust your intuition. When those intuitions are met, you can trust your intuitions. Now, unfortunately, the conditions for expert intuition are rarely satisfied. So we have many intuitions, but when those three conditions are not satisfied, you should not trust them. So we had an intuition about Julie, but that intuition was wrong. Now, sometimes there are no regularities to pick up. So the stock market is unpredictable. When stocks will go up or when stocks will go down, a particular stock cannot be known in advance. If it was possible to know it in advance, then somebody would already have bought the stocks or sold the stocks and made it impossible to guess. So the stock market is designed to be unpredictable. And in an unpredictable situation, if somebody tells you that they have a strong intuition about a stock without knowing something very particular about the company, when they just have an intuition about the stock, don't believe them. Guessing random events requires magical powers, and magical powers are in short supply. So don't trust intuitions in situations that do not provide essential regularity. Now, Another condition that is often not satisfied is that the feedback that you get when you make judgments is either poor or delayed. So, for example, people who make hiring decisions. So somebody, a boss is hiring new people. And generally, this is done with high confidence because you have an intuition that you understand the person. But research shows that people are actually quite poor at selecting who will be the better worker and who will be worse. They believe they're good, but they're actually not very good. Another example where there is no feedback is judges who set, well, there is an institution that when you have somebody who has been arrested for a crime and is going to be tried, he sometimes is sent home to wait for the trial, and sometimes he's kept in prison. So that's a decision that a judge makes. And the judges who make those decisions get absolutely no feedback. They really don't know about particular people that they send to jail, whether they would have actually committed a crime if they hadn't sent them to jail. And if they sent somebody home and they committed the crime, chances are they don't know it. People who work in insurance companies, they get no feedback. They set a price, they set a premium, and whether or not there is a loss, sometimes you have to wait many, many years before you know whether the premium was correct or not, whether there was a loss or not. So the absence of feedback is actually a very common situation. And that leads me to something that I think I find quite surprising and interesting, which is that even in the absence of feedback, professionals develop confident intuitions. And some people are recognized as experts, although there is no way to tell whether their judgments are accurate or not. So when you have a chess player, everybody can know whether he won the game or didn't win the game. But when you have an underwriter, or when you have a judge who sets bail, we really cannot know. And certainly the people themselves do not know. And yet, professionals without feedback still develop confident intuitions. And some people are still recognized by others as experts. And if you stop to think about it, that is a bit of a mystery. We call them respect experts because what makes them experts is that they're respected by other people. But nothing guarantees a connection with reality. I'm quite sure if you think back when there was a lot of astrology, that some astrologers were considered experts. They were trusted more than others, probably because they were intelligent and they spoke with authority and confidence. But if astrology is nonsense, then expertise is an illusion. But that illusion is very powerful. Now, I'm not passing judgment on respect experts. I think I'm a respect expert. It's not that people judge me by actual accomplishments. I'm taken more seriously than I deserve, and that's a characteristic of respect experts. Now, that's a mystery if you stop to think about it. How come, even in the absence of feedback, that people's confidence in their professional judgments increases over time? And I can add that often their confidence in their judgment increases over time, although they remain quite different from the judgment. This is what I mentioned earlier as noise. We saw that in underwriters in insurance companies. Those are people who estimate risks and they get absolutely no feedback. And they disagree among themselves a lot. They don't know it. And experts or experienced professionals do not agree more than novices. So why do they become increasingly confident? And here, I think, is the answer. The answer is because they increasingly agree with themselves. So here I am, I make judgment about risks every day, and I'm considering a new risk, and it reminds me of the risks that I saw some time ago and of a decision I made some time ago. And the decision I want to make is about the same as the decision I made then. So, and that gives me confidence that my decision is correct. So there is a mechanism of building confidence that has absolutely nothing to do with reality. So I encounter problems similar to those I dealt with in the past. I let my previous judgments guide the present one, and the growing consistency of my judgment convinces me that I'm right. Now, the bottom line, and it's a very important bottom line, and if I teach you nothing else but the next sentence, I will have done a good job, is subjective confidence is a very weak indication of accuracy. People can be very sure of judgments that are wrong. They can be very sure of judgments where they have absolutely no basis for deciding whether the judgment is right or wrong. High subjective confidence in your judgment only means that you cannot imagine an alternative to what you're thinking. And to evaluate your own intuitions and the intuitions of other people, you should never take a person's subjective confidence at face value, even if that person is you. What you should do is you should check whether there is a regular world behind that intuition and whether the person who has the intuition had a sufficient opportunity to learn the regular world. Now, how do unfounded intuitions come about? And here we can learn a lot from the example of Julie, the girl I mentioned earlier. First, the matching mechanism. That implies that you actually answer a question that you were not asked. You were asked, what is her grade point average? You answer, how precocious a reader was she? This substitution of a simple question for a complex one is a very general process. So for example, you meet somebody and you have to decide whether to trust them or not. And you actually do not have information about how reliable they are. But what you do have is a feeling of whether you like them or not. So the question, how much should I trust her, becomes the question, how much do I like her? And how much do I like her is an easy question because I already have an answer. So I answer the difficult question by answering the easy question instead. For example, will he be a strong leader? I can ask about somebody, and I can ask, does he act like a strong leader? Does he look like a strong leader? Acting and looking are much easier to assess than whether a leader is actually strong. So substitution leads to absurdities. As I was telling you earlier, how much information does the reading age actually provide? Not all that much. How many things could happen between age 4 and age 18 that will affect grade point average? A lot can happen. So the correct way to think about Julie and about many other problems is the following. You should think about the problem as a general problem. So I'm asking about grade point, about the average of grades. So you should think, what is the average grade of a graduating student or of a graduating girl, because you already know she is a girl. And I don't know what the average grade is in Ukraine, but I suppose it can't be much higher than 8 or 7 or 8, you know. Now, what you should do when you're guessing Julie's grade point average, you should start from the average. You should start from the average category. If I knew nothing about Julie, what would I say? And then you should adjust a little, not too much. Instead of going all the way to matching about her grades to your evaluation of how precocious she is, you should actually adjust very little. So substitution yields judgments that are both overly extreme and overconfident. So there is another mechanism that generates intuition, and this is that we look for a coherent interpretation of the world we live in. We look for confirming evidence. And what we do when we get information and the information is ambiguous is we interpret the information in a way that makes it consistent with what you already think. We call that the confirmation bias, or look for coherence. And the confirmation bias creates, when you have a coherent view of the world, you have high confidence in it, even if you had no sufficient reason for that confidence. So our view of the world is a radical simplification. We view the world as much simpler than it really is, and we view our judgments of the world as much more accurate than they are. And confidence, if you want to think about confidence in a slightly cynical way, you can see that confidence in my own judgment comes from a deficient imagination, because we have great difficulty imagining other ways of seeing things than how I see them. Now, I don't have a watch, so let me find out what the time is. Barbara, what's the time?
We have actually 10 more minutes for you for main lectures. If you need more, it could be more.
I've been speaking for 35 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'll be fine. Now, here is a new topic that I wanted to talk about. And first, I'll ask you a question. You have two professionals who make a quantitative judgment. And by a judgment, I mean they can't compute it. They have to think about it and come up with an answer. What would be a tolerable difference between them? So you have two underwriters who are looking at the same risk, and each of them decides how much money is that risk worth, what the premium should be to cover that risk. And of course, two underwriters are not going to agree perfectly. If you have two judges looking at exactly the same case, they're not going to agree perfectly on the sentence that they pass. But I can ask you a question. What looks to you like an exaggerated difference? What looks like too much? What looks acceptable? And most people think that a 10% difference is about reasonable. So that if you have two underwriters and they differ by 10%, that's okay. If you have two judges and they differ by 10%, that's okay. But what happens actually is that people differ among themselves much more than 10%. So I'll tell you how my research on noise began. About 10 years ago, I was working, consulting in an insurance company, and I had the idea of running an exercise. And in the exercise, people from the company prepared problems, underwriting problems, completely realistic. And about 50 underwriters were given half a day to deal off their work, to deal with those problems and to set amounts for the premium as they do every day. And now you have 50 judgments of the same problem, and you can ask, if I take 2 underwriters at random, by how much will they differ? And again, people expect about 10%. But actually, the answer in that insurance company was about 50%, 5 times as much as most people expect. And the same thing is true for judges when they pass sentences. There's enormous variability when you run experiments on judges. There is a lot of variability. Each judge, you present them with exactly the same information, and you ask what is the appropriate sentence, and they don't give you the same answer. That is what we call noise. And there is a lot of noise. There is a lot of noise in every judgment that we look at. There's noise sentencing. There is noise in judging patterns. There is noise in judging essays, so that the same essay will be given different grades by different judges. We know that by different readers. There is noise in hiring. That is, somebody will hire someone that somebody else would reject. There is noise in evaluation of people on the job. And there is noise in medicine. When the problem is very simple, like diagnosing a cold or the flu, you won't get much noise. But when it actually requires judgment, you get a lot of noise. So that's another problem with human judgment. Human judgment is problematic because our confidence is often unjustified. We feel very confident when we shouldn't be confident. And human judgment is noisy. And by noisy, what I mean is, and it's a difficult idea to accept, when you look at the world, you think you see the world correctly. I think I see the world correctly. I think I see the world as I do because that's the way it is. But actually, when you look more closely, it turns out that different people live in different worlds, and they live in worlds that are much more different than each of them thinks. And that is in part because of a lack of imagination I was talking about earlier, because of the exaggerated confidence I was talking about earlier. People think that others will see the world the same way I do. You know, I see the world correctly. I think you're a nice person and a reliable and intelligent person. So I'm sure you must see the world exactly the way I do, or approximately the way I do. Actually, you probably don't. When you expect 10% difference, you find 50% difference. And that seems to be a very general rule. So there are reasons to question intuition. As I started my lecture with marvelous intuition, there is true intuitive expertise, but it's not all that common. We know when we can trust intuition. And the 3 conditions for the development of expertise are also 3 conditions that it would take for people to have a chance to make similar judgments. Agree on what is a strong move and what is not a strong move. They don't agree perfectly, but they generally agree, master chess players. So educated experts tend to agree when they're true intuitive experts. When they're just respect experts, people who feel they're experts, people that others think are experts, you maybe should not always trust them because they're biased and because they're noisy. So intuition is both marvelous and flawed. And with this, I will close and open to questions.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And we are ready for questions now. And I will start reading questions the same way as we had these questions from our participants. First question, what we have, Mr. Kahneman, how would you comment on the well-known Einstein quote? The intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. What do you think he meant by saying that? Thanks.
Could you read that quote slowly?
Yeah, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift.
Faith in intuition is very common, and I know that the message of my lecture today goes directly against that idea. Now, it is true that our thinking is very largely dominated by intuitions, but those intuitions are not necessarily correct. That is, the person who called intuition a sacred gift may have been thinking of cases where intuition is truly marvelous, but many intuitions are not marvelous and should not be trusted. And thinking rationally in asking, is the confidence in intuition justified? That, I think, is an important question to ask. And I mentioned earlier that the most important conclusion of my talk today was that subjective confidence, which people who have intuitions always have, is not a good guide to the accuracy of beliefs.
Thank you very much. Next question we have about point like how to avoid the simplification of the way of seeing things. As for you,
I'll ask you to repeat.
How to avoid the simplification of seeing things.
There is no way to avoid it completely. I mean, we form impressions of the world. We cannot think, and we form those impressions fast. And this is something that just happens to us, the impressions and the way we see the world. We cannot analyze everything. We should not analyze everything. Most of the time, we live in a world that we understand pretty much, and most of the things that we do reasonably well. The key, I think, is to know when you must slow down. That is, to know when the problem is sufficiently important that I must ask the question of whether my intuition is sufficient or whether I need to collect more information and think in a different way.
And the next question from we have from high school students about can you specify can you see any difference between fast thinking from your book concept and intuition, or it's similar?
It's a similar concept. Intuitive thinking, as I've described it, is fast thinking. So for people who have seen my book, yes, the book is really about intuitive thinking.
Are intuitive conclusions measurably based on present knowledge and experience, or could be without it?
Intuition is always based on something, but it can be based either on expertise, or it can be based on answering a different question, or it can be based on agreeing with yourself. There are many sources of intuition.
And next question is more strategic for us and for general people. Can you give your advice how to work with people who are believing in experts without expertise, without just they're believing in thoughts of these experts, but without expertise?
How can you? I roughly a question, but can you help me understand?
A question from this participant actually was about that there are a lot of people around us who are believing in, for example, in fake news, in something like that, and they're trusting fake experts. And because of fast thinking, probably first of all, because it looks like real, but in fact it's not. Probably you have any recommendation or advices for these guys how to avoid this?
I wish I had a good answer to that question, because that's one of the more important questions that people face in the world these days, how to deal with fake information. People believe in fake information in the same way that they believe in true information. From their point of view, they're completely right. They actually believe in it, and they're convinced, and they have very high confidence, and it's extremely difficult to change people's mind. In fact, I'm not optimistic about changing people's mind. Very, very hard. Long term, the solution is education. And it's not a complete solution, because educated people can also fall for fake news. But there is no better solution.
Yeah, and currently we are in brutal war against Ukraine by Russians, and a lot of territory under shelling and under missiles attack, etc. And we have missile threats alerts. We have alerts that it should be dangerous next couple of hours or something like that. And a lot of people says that we have intuitions that we should not leave this place. Everything will be all right with us. And it is a huge mistake what could be done by these guys and our people. Can you, and question from this participant is about, from your point of view, is it any instruments or methods what we can better influence communication to support these people to avoid emotional thinking and intuitive thinking of their security, and to make them to believe in real threats?
Well, what is important in this context is for the official sources of information to be reliable. People have to trust the official sources of information, and the official sources of information have to deserve that trust. This is not always true. It's, I think, not true on the other side, but there is no other way. Lying to people in the long term, when you have a completely closed system, when you have a dictatorship, you can lie to people for many, many years and they will not find out the truth. But in an open system, lying eventually comes out. And and you have to believe in your leaders that they're not lying to you.
Thank you very much for your answer. And next question about your personal experience and your estimation, how you said about Julia and this visitor is interesting about, as a person who made so many research about people and their behavior, can you share your opinion? How rational or irrational people are in average? Let's say in a scale out of 100 points, for example.
Well, I have a moderately long answer to this.
Great.
I rarely use the word rational. The word rational actually is a technical term. It's a technical term in decision theory, and those are people who do not make mistakes. They are completely rational. All their beliefs are consistent, all their preferences are internally consistent, and they do not make mistakes. That's an impossibility. By that definition, nobody is rational. And the question, but that doesn't mean that people are irrational. That's a word I really don't like. That people, irrational people are those who are completely dominated by their emotions and don't think at all. They exist, but they're not all that common. Most of us are not rational because we cannot be, but most of us are not irrational. Most of us are reasonable people. And reasonable people make mistakes, but reasonable people get on reasonably well in the world. So it's not the proper scale is not a scale of rationality, because in the definition of rationality, the technical definition, you have to be perfect. If you're not perfect, you're not rational. And humans cannot be perfect. So I don't want to use your scale of rationality. I would prefer to use a scale of how reasonable people are. And there, I would say that people vary, but, it's quite a few people are very reasonable. They deserve grades of 80 or 90 on a scale of reasonableness. Other people are really quite unreasonable. That's a good scale. Rationality, irrationality is just not a very good scale.
I think it's very, very valuable opinion. And next question we have about these guys wondering whether we could trust the collective intuition more than individual one.
That's a very interesting question, because there are, it turns out, two kinds of errors. There is bias and there is noise, which is variability. When you average a lot of individual judgments, you can get rid of noise completely. The noise is something that when you collect enough judgments, you'll get rid of. You will be left with bias, and collective intuition is no less biased than individual intuition. And sometimes it goes the other way. That is, when I belong to a community that believes in something that is false, I will believe it more strongly than I would by myself, because I look around me and other people agree with me, and their agreement is another source of confidence. And if their intuitions are poor, it's a very poor source of confidence. So it's another case where subjective confidence or even trust in others is not necessarily justified.
And next question is more general about behavioral sciences and behavioral economics. What is, on your personal opinion, what is the next step of developing behavioral economics in future? And what are the directions? And probably you can see implementation of it in real life, like in businesses or in politics, etc.
There is a Hebrew proverb that I like, which says that prophecy is for fools, that the future is, certainly the future of science is impossible to forecast. I mean, 10 years ago, we had no idea of what would be discovered during those 10 years. Artificial intelligence has moved in 10 years more than anybody could have believed possible, but other things, problems that people thought would be solved were not solved. I have no idea what's coming next. One thing that is clear is, it may affect behavioral economics too, but it certainly is affecting my field, which is psychology. And this is that brain research is going to become increasingly more important. And our understanding of the brain at the moment is very rudimentary, but this is a place where in the next 50 years, wonderful things will probably happen. And here I made a prophecy and I'm a fool.
Daniel, and probably last question by your time. Is it any relations between creativity and intuition?
Probably yes. I mean, creativity involves, ideas that come to mind without reason. You don't know why you're drawn to them. So creativity is intuitive. That doesn't mean that intuition is necessarily creative.
And can you make your personal advices and wishes for Ukrainian people and Ukrainian youth these days?
I lived through World War II. I was a child during World War II. And patience, courage, and luck.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time for this lecture. It was very valuable for us, and we are very, very in huge pleasure to you and grateful for your time.
It was an honor for me to participate even in a small way in what you're doing and in what is happening to you these days. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Дякуємо всім. Нагадую, що можна скористатися промокодом нашого формату для купівлі книжки Деніела Камена за знижкою.